it already looks better. So even if there is not much that we can prove on trade, this is already where you get the reputation of the economy and credibility for like those three aims. Secondly, it is essential to understand that less stuff gets banned. This looks like, for example, regulation and laws on Chinese cheap imports Chinese expensive imports being more charitable under Trump, but it's also about the fact that because Trump has such a favorable relationship with China and not so much with other countries, for example, in the West, it means that they will be able to stop with these trade embargoes and so on and so forth. Then Kamala will likely argue for more trade embargo, also for ideological reasons. The fact that for the Democratic it's a very difficult thing to, for example, import from China with constant public criticism on the Uyghurs, it won't be a problem for China to go past this regulation. We believe that this will lead to more economic prowess to be in China and more capability for them to attract investment and also to be perceived stronger. This also manifests in the fact of the communist ideology getting more traction because it is seen that the capitalist US is not faring as strong as it has been, and thus the Chinese one being better because of it. For all those reasons, OG, thank you.
Okay, sorry, 1 second. Oops, can I have your phone for the timer? Thanks. Okay. Okay.
actually wouldn't like to be recorded if that's okay.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to continue building on my partner's case about how, given the fact that the economy is in the biggest interest of the CCP in terms of staying in power, how it is much, much worse for them if Trump is in office. I'm going to do a lot of rebuttal to OG, and a lot of my case is going to lie not just in the economic point, but also providing a comparative for if Kamala Harris is in office, and a lot of this will be direct engagement and direct response to OG, in my opinion. So let's start with some general rebuttal. First of all, I think, panel, this whole point of Trump is completely incompetent and he's an idiot and he never listens to anyone and whatever, you can say that. I'm not saying they can't say that, of course. Like it or not, he still enacted policies. He still enacted very strong policies that worked, that did successfully limit, like, China's ability to trade with the United States. These tariffs actually worked. The US actually stopped using Chinese goods very, very commonly. So saying that just he's incompetent, he won't be able to because he's too much of an idiot now, that's not actually real analysis given any past, present, or future like considerations or anything new as to why that would be the case. Then this idea of like this NATO idea of, well, Trump's just gonna completely act alone so everyone else can do whatever they want, because even if he pulls out, it's just US alone doing it. First of all, it's unlikely that Trump actually pulls out of NATO. If you actually listen to what Trump said for this like whole NATO scandal, it was more of like a threat to get others to respond, because everyone's supposed to give a certain amount of like money to NATO every single year, and they weren't. So Trump was like, listen, we're gonna pull out if you guys don't start pulling your weight. Overwhelmingly, a lot of them did start pulling their weight, especially in places like Germany. So he stayed in NATO. Assuming that they continue to do that, he is going to stay in NATO. That then also, if you do want to then start raising the Taiwan point, you want to start raising that point, I think the idea is that America would be very, very highly protected from foreign interests trying to get at them, because they would still stay in NATO, and they would actually be staying in a much stronger NATO because more countries are putting more money towards NATO. Not yet. And then this idea of like, the Democrats, right? They hate China. They don't want to work with them. They never work with them. First of all, yes, they do. This whole idea of the TikTok ban, which was their biggest example, that was actually Republican. That was actually Donald Trump's party that wanted to ban TikTok because of the data issues. The Democrats actually love TikTok, mostly because it helps them appeal to young voters who exist very primarily on the platform. Many, many, many Democrats are on TikTok because of that appeal. Additionally, if you look at it from more of the structural economic reasons, if you look at the Democrat versus Republican like economic goals in America, if you actually notice, the Democratic economic policy is more about like keeping things cheap, versus the Republicans are all about like giving people more of their money, right? So like lowering interests, cutting taxes, all that kind of stuff, versus the Democrats are like, let's reduce student loans, or let's cut student loans. So it's more making things cheaper. That actually makes them more likely in the current state, given the fact that China still has a very powerful, cheap export economy. That does make the Democrats very likely that they would still tolerate China's like terrible Uyghur Muslim, like whatever intentions, in order to still gain economic benefit that they are able to provide, so that the Democrats can focus on cutting things from within the United States, such as student loans. Cool. And then this whole idea of Europe. As I already said, I think a lot of Europe has already started to follow Trump's lead. And fine, if you even believe the extent that they said, listen, the EU is overwhelmingly still more liberal, it keeps them generally still in line because the EU is a liberal institution, even if there's conservative states still underneath them. Under OG's reasoning, the EU probably then also hates China. Like, even if you believe that they're still liberal, they also hate China. And if you accept the reasoning, they probably are also less likely to work with China because of TikTok and because of like economics and all this kind of ideas. And also because they're more likely to be sympathetic to Ukraine and to give more of their money to Ukraine. And then if the war eventually ends, to start trading with Ukraine again. It's kind of a contradictory point of analysis. Great. Moving on, finally. Great. As my partner already started to build, is this really case for like why the America First policy means that China's economy will eventually stagnate, and how this will eventually like basically ruin their social contract, right? She already covered how they're not really buying parts from China, both in a manufactured goods sense, but also in a sense of this green policy, right? This America First policy also includes going back to like, we are not buying like solar panels anymore. We're not doing the electric car battery shit. If you want to do that, you can do it from within America. And also, it's not really a priority. So this kind of takes away this already like gigantic market that China has already developed. I'm going to add in one more point of analysis here, which is the America First policy includes this really interesting subtext of kicking Chinese expansion out of America. America. Under a lot of democratic rule, they allowed companies from China to establish position in America in places like South Dakota and Texas and Oklahoma. I'll take it in a minute. Where essentially they could still do their work, they could still do like the Chinese work and stuff like that, but it would now be on American soil where it now wouldn't even cost as much to get the goods over to America. Again, one of that like democratic economic policy, they're willing to tolerate it, right? Under Trump's plan for America First, that involves kicking all of the Chinese factories out of America. But notably, the infrastructure would still be there, right? Keeping that infrastructure and using it for America. Yeah, I'll take it from opening, sorry.
So one thing that is clear about this thing, about Trump's American policy, economic policy, is that it is going to weaken their position globally, meaning that more partners open up for China to actually export to and trade with, since the US is not a viable partner anymore.
I truly don't understand how losing your number one guy is somehow mitigated by the fact that you still have your 2, 3, and 4 guys. Like, they have assumably had all of the EU and India and Africa to trade with already. It's just you're losing number one. It's pretty much simple math. So kicking this Chinese expansion out of America is going to really, I think, put the nail on the coffin of the fact that even if China wants to cooperate with us, even if they're willing to send us really cheap goods and stuff like that, you can't do it over here anymore. It's not even worth having the goods immediately accessible to us because they will be kicked out. Last bit on like impacts. Panel, I think our impacts are just incredibly clear and much easier proven in this debate. But in case you still don't believe it, this idea of like the economy stagnation, how is this going to actually affect the Communist Party in China? It's going to basically be the collapse of their social contract. As Ellie said, they're already sacrificing a lot of rights for the trade-off of, listen, you have money, so shut up. Like, you don't need all this freedom. However, this is essentially problematic because not only would the wages be going down because there would be like less trade to give, actually a lot of Chinese jobs would now be put out of jobs. This idea of like other stuff that the Communist Party provides, whether it's entertainment or community or all of that, is a lot of times dependent on the people having stable jobs and stable routines in which they're able to actually participate in this communist society, right? If they don't have that anymore, essentially China's becoming a failed state, which has now reached a point of industrialization where they need to be doing social reforms, but they can't because they've lost their number one buyer of those goods. And that is the final proof as to why they're going to lose their economy. Because we prove that the economy is the most important and why our impacts are more clear, and we prove how even on the flip side, democratic policy makes them not able or willing to get involved. For all of those reasons, I'm proud to oppose. Thank you.
I thank the previous speaker. I'm happy to call upon the member of government.
Panel ready? Let's start with some LO responses, then framing, then substantive case. I think the OO case is characterized by a lot of factual inaccuracies about what the Chinese government looks like and also what the different political positions between Democrats and Republicans actually are. Let's start with the core of the thesis of their case, that the social contract between the Communist Party and the Chinese people is about economic growth. I think, one, this is in direct contradiction to the Chinese communist line, which is explicitly not about infinite economic growth, but rather about like things like social standards, but also a sense of community and homogeny. I think, second, that there's no tipping point argument here because the Chinese government doesn't rule through a social contract, but rather through fear, repression, and cracking down on any dissidents. I think this is a sort of thumper argument because even if you do get any sort of economic stagnation, it definitely can't match the level of economic stagnation under leaders like Mao or Hu Jintao, which means that as long as the Chinese government still has a repressive arm, you definitely don't get any of their impacts. Sure, they might be afraid of these things, but you definitely don't get things like mass social unrest. I think finally, yeah, you definitely don't get mass social unrest. No. Second argument they give you is that Trump's going to move manufacturing aside. No, he won't. One, His biggest supporters are big business. The only way to force manufacturers to stay inside is to provide things like tax incentive regulations and just generally like rules that prevent them from getting cheaper manufacturing. Second, Trump himself manufactures there, so I think it's unlikely that he would want to alienate his big business owners. Second, they said they're going to limit China. There's a limit for Chinese FDI. One, it's simply untrue that the U.S. is the biggest source of Chinese FDI. U.S. investors are simply skeptical of the Chinese Communist government and that they can steal IP and that they can steal the money. For example, in July last year, the Chinese government released a 6-point plan about how they're going to comfort U.S. investors and bring more FDI. No U.S. investors took the bait. They didn't get any increase in FDI. I think this is simply untrue. The majority of FDI comes from Southeast Asia. But furthermore, I think FDI is simply a drop in the bucket of the Chinese economy. We've seen that when the Chinese government is unable to get FDI, as in when their housing market, they're just able to fund it internally, i.e. via like loans they probably won't pay back. Second, they say Trump shops green tech from China. I think we're going to explain why the soft power argument is going to be more important here. Two, I think that all of Chinese green tech is about domestic consumption, less exporting. For example, the EV market is 90% domestic consumption. No. And second, I think the United States is not buying Chinese goods, even if they were going to green transition anyway. So for example, every single sort of government push to get things like solar panels has all about been funding US domestic consumers and then buying that themselves. So I think it's symmetrical at best, and I don't think you get any offense here. The DLO also gives this idea of tariffs, but I think that it's largely symmetrical as well, because even though Trump is stronger rhetorically on tariffs, Biden kept the tariffs the exact same and even raised them. Given that Kamala is his vice president, I think it's likely that continues. Next, they talk about why he won't pull out of NATO. I think it's a lot more nuanced characterization here. It's not about pulling out or strengthening or getting more funding, but rather casting doubt on collective defense obligations that undermines the confidence. No, that undermines the confidence of allies to do this. Okay, onto the framing. I think that we largely agree with the framing of the interests of the CCP, but I think that the CCP in terms of being a regional hegemon and wanting to remain economically strong. Our first substantive point is about the EV market. I think China is dominating the global EV market with about 90% of complete consumption. However, the United States is competitive on the market because of subsidies provided by the Democrats to Tesla, for example, like to EV consumers. For example, you get $7,000 right now if you want to buy an electric vehicle. But Trump and JD Vance have promised to remove these subsidies. I think this kills U.S. global competitiveness on the EV market, but also hampers U.S. domestic opportunities to buy EVs in general. What does this mean? I think that because EVs are really the only realistic way the green transition is going to be led, no other proposed solution is politically palatable to both left and right-wing people, but also is likely to have a significant impact on carbon emissions. I think that means that the impact is China is going up, like Trump's base hates this because EVs are seen as liberal and an affront to gas and oil industries, but I think the impact is that China is going to get stronger economic growth, but also control the green transition insofar as that their tech is going to get a lot better and they're going to have the highest production of EVs. I think Europe, which wants to transition to EVs, is going to really be beholden where they would otherwise buy American cars. I think the second point here is about U.S. soft power and legitimacy on the global scale. I think OG tries to give you this, but the strongest link they give you is about ties to the EUs, and I just don't think that's the most important thing. Oh yeah, sorry, one more thing about EV. It's the fastest growing Chinese sector, and it's driven purely by domestic spending, which means there's a multiplier effect here that improves the Chinese economy. Okay, soft power. I think the United States is a declining world leader for some of the reasons OG gives you, but a few additional reasons. I think one, they're growing weaker and less consistent on human rights abuses, particularly in places like South Sudan and Darfur. Two, I think they're killing the legitimacy of international organizations, such as like refusing to enforce ICC warrants, like vetoing UN Security Council resolutions, and undermining NATO commitments just generally. I think that China is ready to rise here. One, they're distancing themselves from bad actors like Russia, for example, refusing to meet with Putin in the last 6 months. And two, they're distancing themselves from actors like North Korea because they enforced sanctions in 2017. They're also promoting their self abroad. For example, there's a recent New Yorker article where a diplomat says, when the US sends one delegate to a conference, China sends 20, okay? They are trying to dominate these smaller regional conferences through things like the One Belt One Road Initiative, BRICS, and ASEAN. And I don't think, especially in the global south, you see that kind of US pull. The impact here is that China is gonna be, no, please, I'll take you in a minute. Yeah, next argument. Sure, I'll take closing now.
Okay, so your opening has a whole argument about why this will be good for the Chinese economy, and that's the impact. You spend a minute of your speech explaining why the CCP doesn't care about the economy at all. Is that not right?
No, so it's not that they don't care about the economy, it's that the economy is not a tipping point for social unrest. They care about the economy, but it's just not an impact to the extent that OO characterizes it. Next point here. I think that right now China is suffering from a form of brain drain in which the most and talented people don't want to live in a repressive society and they'd rather go to Western liberal places like the United States primarily. For example, the United States takes about 80% of the Chinese consumption. Trump hates Chinese workers. He thinks they're all spies. He thinks they're part of the 1,000-person plan. And I think limiting high-skilled workers more broadly, they also want to just cancel high-skilled visa, forces these workers to stay in China and help technological growth. I think that helps China broadly, not only increase their efficiency in EVs and other green tech sectors, but also just broadly keep skills and state secrets within the country. Finally, on banning TikTok, I think OO's characterization is simply wrong. Here's what happened. Democrats wanted to ban TikTok. They were going to ban it in May, but Trump called Speaker Mike Johnson and asked him to delay the votes while he could gain support to stop the TikTok bill. He was unable to do so, but that didn't pass with the 2/3 majority. And yeah, they didn't pass with the 2/3 majority, so as president, he would be able to, he would not ban TikTok. He would not have his Justice Department enforce the bill. I think that's good for Chinese espionage because they're able to have basically recordings of every single phone in the United States. Probably a good thing for planning future hegemonic activities.
I think the previous speaker, I'm happy to call upon the member of the opposition.
So we're going to run a case about the economy, so I'm going to really quickly deal with what CG said about the economy. They did not mitigate the importance of the economy. They said they are bounded by rules, by the opening's characterization. In fact, they themselves said we agree with opening and framing. What does opening say? Their opening say in framing. Their opening says that the CCP cares about their internal authority that they get for their economic stability. That means that CG, when they are analyzing to you why they do not care about internal stability and why they don't care about the economy because of that, they're in direct conflict with not just opening but themselves when they say that they care about their framing. Note, this is a debate about the Chinese economy because the Chinese economy is the most important thing for the CCP, both in terms of their internal stability, but secondly, in terms of everything that the CCP wants to do. That is the military operations that OG talked about. That is the expansion into more global markets that relies on their own internal financial stability, their own internal economic growth. Those are reasons why the economy matters for China. Okay then, in this speech, firstly, some rebuttal to CG, then an extension about why China needs a strong dollar. This is in direct opposition to what OG said. The way in which we are going to win this debate is by flipping what OG said. This is not going to be what OO said. This is going to be what CO said. Okay. In terms of CG, what do they say? They have two niche arguments. One is about electric vehicles, and the second is about high-skilled workers. My first response is I think both of these are marginal. I think China has bigger issues than how many electric vehicles they are selling. I think their bigger issues probably how much of everything else they're selling. Secondly, I don't think China is struggling much with high-skilled workers for two reasons. One, most people in China are not high-skilled workers. That means they have most of their people still staying. So I don't think it's going to be that big of an impact. Two, this would probably be bad for China if their other high-skilled workers had to stay in China because high-skilled workers can make lots of money elsewhere. And what people who come from a country and then they go to a different country and they make lots of money do is that they send some money back to their families so that their family can live better lives. That money then gets taxed by the Chinese government. That means that high-skilled workers working in countries where they are making more money is good for the CCP. But even if it was not, I don't understand why we have to have Trump be in office for the CCP to regulate their own immigration. I think if the CCP is really struggling with too many people leaving their country, the CCP can just deal with that with their own legislation. Then they talk about electric vehicles. This is bad for two reasons. One, it's bad because the US is the biggest export market, not just for electric vehicles, this will apply later, but for everything Chinese. That's their biggest trading partner. It's very close to them. It's a very big economy. It's got a lot of people. Those are the reasons China tends to export a lot to the US right now, especially electric vehicles, because US people, most of them tend to like electric vehicles a lot because they like Teslas or whatever, I don't know. This is bad for China if they're going to not be able to sell most of their electric vehicles to the US anymore. That means that they're going to have to sell them for cheaper to other countries who want less of them. That means they're going to have electric vehicles over so they can produce less of them. That means they don't get their impacts about leading the green wave. And secondly, it means that they're making less money of it, so they're not good. Secondly, if this is also bad if the US encourages domestic production. OO never explains why the US will get domestic production. Their analysis goes, Trump wants it, so it'll happen. We're going to explain why you do get domestic production in our extension, about why China needs a strong dollar. Firstly, I'm going to quickly explain what strong and weak currencies mean, because OG does not, and it's why their argument does not work. Their argument is a weak dollar makes the UN better because it's stronger, so, this is not how that works. When we talk about weak and strong currencies, we're talking about relative value. That is to say, the dollar is stronger than the euro, because a euro is worth less dollars. So $1 is worth more than €1. That means that the dollar is stronger than the euros. How does that impact things? It means if I am a country which uses euros and I have to buy dollars, it's going to be more expensive to me. If I'm trading with a weaker currency like the yuan, it means it's going to be cheaper for me because $1 can buy me more than yuan, then it can buy me €1 can buy me more in yuan than it can buy me in dollars. So if your currency is weaker than another country, it is lower, it is cheaper for them to buy from you. If it is higher than another country, it is cheaper for you to buy from them. That is why import-based economies like the US currently tend to want to have high-value currencies compared to the rest of the world because it makes it cheaper for them to buy everything else. Export-based economies like China want to have low-value currencies because it makes them more competitive. It makes their prices lower for other countries. Now, then, countries are able to control the value of their currency by holding in reserves. That means that less of it is traded. That means that there's less total value out there. Also, things like inflation, and they do deflation and stuff like that. If somebody here studies econ, they can explain it better, but that's my idea. Okay. Also note that this isn't just during Trump's presidency, which is how we are also going to add a new weighing mech. It's very difficult and very radical for countries to radically change the positioning of their currency compared to other worlds and compared to other currencies. That's why when inflation is going so big, that's one of the reasons why it's really bad, because it means that your position in the world currency scheme is radically changing. That means all your imports and exports are also changing. Note, countries don't want to do this for two reasons. Firstly, it is risky. There can be a lot of effects that you haven't thought of or that are just plain bad. Two, you get some level of path dependency. If I've built an economy about importing things because I have a high value of my currency, I don't want to lower my value because it means my economy right now will not work. That's why this is a long-term shift. Nobody else in this debate shows any long-term shifts. This should be enough of itself if we show the impacts to why we win. I'll take a POI before I continue.
So if you want to have global power and people to recognize, you want to use your currency so that they would be in a similar sphere and rely on you on their trade.
Yeah, thank you.
If you have a higher currency.
Two reasons that's not true. One, because China wants to export lots because they can export lots because they have cheap labor and lots of materials. It wouldn't make sense for China to import. They can make a bunch of stuff themselves. Two, that's not how currencies work. Things are reserves because lots of people have them in reserve. People already have the dollar in reserve, like China, which is why China wants the dollar to be stable. Two reasons this is bad for China. Firstly, it's bad for Chinese exports. The second one is it's bad for Chinese investments. Note, this is exactly what OG says. We're flipping exactly what they say in PM. Firstly, in terms of why this is bad for Chinese exports, what does our OO say in terms of exports? They say Trump wants manufacturing in the US. It's unclear why that would succeed. Like a president saying, I want this, doesn't automatically make it succeed. They need to implement policy and they'll see resistance from that. But regardless, secondly, it's unclear how that doesn't clash. Okay, whatever, I don't care about this. Then they say that this hurts Chinese exports. Why? They don't give a reason. If Trump manufactures more in the US, why does that hurt China per se? That's not a given. It could benefit China because it means they can buy more things from the US to produce more things. They need to explain. To be clear, what OO says is correct, but they didn't explain why, aka they don't meet their burden. How do we? Chinese exports to the US, that will happen on both sides because the US just need things that they don't have. But secondly, if the US is going to manufacture more, they need more things like steels. They need to buy them from countries like China. This is harder for two reasons. One, it is less attractive to the US because your dollar is now more costly relative to theirs. That means the fixed cost, the things like shipping, matter less because the price, the fluctuating part is changing. Secondly, it means, fuck it. So that's why Chinese exports to the US are going to be harmed. But the exports to the rest of the world are going to be even more harder because the US is shifting their economy towards exporting. The US has the production capacities for the same reason China does. They have lots of people, lots of lands, and lots of resources. China doesn't want to compete with the US on resources. They want to sell a whole bunch of shit to them and make a whole bunch of money and be really happy. Vote CO.
And I think the previous speaker, I'm happy to go up on the government with.
My biggest problem with the opposition bench is that all their impacts are quite symmetric whoever wins the US elections. I think they need to understand that the US adversity to China through direct methods of like competing with them is something that happens on either sides of Democrats or Republicans winning. I think that we have provided you ways in which Trump specifically is weakening the US in itself as an actor without wanting to weaken China per se through his policies. And this is why the CCP can benefit through him winning. I think I need to do a disclaimer before I differentiate ourselves from OG. The thing that that MO was trying to say that it was a knife, that was a rebuttal to OO. We weren't saying we don't care about the economy. We were saying that even if economic instability happens, which we already disproved that it doesn't on OO side, it doesn't mean necessarily like social unrest, and this is not how the CCP works. He works with terror, but whatever. Okay, why we beat OG? I think that first of all, we provide a different mechanism from economic isolationism for why the Chinese economy gets better if Donald Trump wins. Why is this good? I think it is good because economic isolationism is claimed to be good or bad in some ways by both sides of opening. And second of all, I'm not sure how exclusive it is to Trump per se. I'm not sure how exclusive trade wars or like anti-China policies are exclusive to Trump per se, or like to Democrats in general. And both OO and OG are actually claiming this. I think that this impact is quite symmetrical at the end of the day. But we give you a separate mechanism through the electric vehicles, which at the present moment, the US represents 80% of this market globally. But Trump is going to weaken that through the subsidies that he wants to impose. And that's specifically a Trump measure that he's taking that's not related to Chinese policies that Democrats would take. I think that this is the moment when you're actually helping the Chinese do that. Second of all, because they also talk about EU and how like Trump doesn't care that much about EU, so that moves EU closer to China. I think that this is a mechanism that is less efficient than what we provided to you that might bring China closer to the EU through soft power that you're gaining because Trump is just shitty at doing his soft power, and we provided more mechanisms to justify that soft power than just simply saying that Trump doesn't care about the EU. But second of all, independent of that, we provided the second mechanism that the EU wants to turn green, and even OO concedes that the green power is limited by Trump. So I think that the entire opening half, they're just making our case look stronger because we are the ones who give the Chinese the upper hand in the electric vehicle market, and that is what is getting them closer to EU and international credibility. I think that they don't actually prove OG didn't sufficiently prove the point of international credibility and didn't provide enough max as we have so far. And I don't see why it is likely or like what's the proximity with the motion that the fact that Democrats winning is not in the interest of the CCP just because there's an ideological interest, like there's an ideological discrepancy between them. They're saying that is important because they are moving towards the service-based economy. But if you are moving towards the service-based economy, I think we provided you the exact mechanism for why for why this happens, which is the fact that Trump is specifically very anti-immigrants, way more than Democrats are, and this is why the high-skilled workers are going to stay into China, and this is why it's actually important because this is very important because CEO is just saying that, oh, these high-skilled workers, they're actually, like, China doesn't need them or they can make more money abroad. But if we are taking the claim that hasn't been, like, rebutted so far from OG that China is moving towards a service-based economy, this is where you need the high-skilled worker base in your home country. And this is how you're going to keep them, just by Trump aggressively pushing them out of the US. Good. Moving on to OO. I think that most of their impacts are quite symmetrical because I don't think much in terms of policy is changing because all the policy directed at China is just the way of the US protecting themselves. Even in terms of TikTok, I think Vikram has proved to you so far that like the TikTok policy was actually trying to be stopped by Trump, and this is like just a way of espionage into the country, which is in the CCP interest after all. And second of all, even if they would prove their economic impacts, which I think we have proven to you that they're quite symmetrical so far, I think that my biggest problem with OO is that they don't talk about the Chinese image. They don't try to rebut OG on that, and I think this is really bad because even if OG doesn't fully access their impacts, because we are the one mechanizing that argument in order to access the impact of like gaining more soft power and being more like better in terms of image on the global scale. I think that this is a bit lacking from the OO case, and it's not a full characterization of CCP interest because this is actually helping them like economically as well. Okay, moving on to CO. I think that this point about like the currency decreasing and like this being very bad for China is simply untrue, because China is in control of their federal bank and their money supply, and they devalued the yen before, and the Western governments responded to that. So I think that they have enough power to respond to these kinds of measures. I think that this is also symmetrical at best on both sides, and I just think that they are a bit like non-comparative, and like their responses to our cases are not very good in terms like how these high-skilled workers market works actually. I think that having more workers in your country, even if you're a country with many people, if you have high skilled workers, that's good for you because they are working in high skilled fields and they are developing your economy. And when you are recovering from COVID economically, this is something that is ultimately good for China and exclusively happens when Trump has won the election. Why I think that at the end of the day, ultimately CG wins, I think that we provided to you the exclusivity of why Trump specifically is making the US weaker. Not specifically why he's more anti-China or more prone to like just give some laws, that, like policies that are specifically anti-China, but because just him as the way he is, him globally, like as soon as he got into power, he exited the Paris Accords, he's just making the US look badly, and it's like China is taking advantage of all of this. I think that, yeah, OG claim that Trump, like, I don't know, like just that Trump is bad and is not seen well, but I don't think they provide sufficient reasons and instances, as Vikram has so far, of why Trump is unlikable and why Trump is pushing the US maybe further away from certain proximities, and why China has a lot to gain from this in general, because US soft power is decreasing and Chinese diplomacy is just increasing. And at the end of the day, even if you don't buy this soft power point, I think that we just provide you a mechanism of economic growth in China that is independent of the policies that Democrats or Republicans might take, because it's specifically about how Trump views like global warming and as being like something that doesn't exist, and electric vehicles. And I think that this is something exclusively that Chinese are very competitive about in the market with the US, and this is something that is very needed with the EU and other actors, that once the US becomes less competitive, they will take advantage and buy from China. That is economic growth. And that is economic growth also because they have more high-skilled workers into their workforce. I think at the end of the day, CG wins.
I think the previous speaker had his thoughts on the opposition way.
By the way, my voice has been failing me a bit, so I hope it's okay. So I'm asking you all to maybe not talk during my speech, and apart from that, if you can't hear me, please say so. Look, Sam proves to you two things that witness this debate. Firstly, China needs the export. That is something that we have been talking about, how China wants its economy to be good. That's what this debate has agreed. But we have told you how China actually needs its export the way that it is set up right now and needs to go on with that. Secondly, Sam has told you how this really hurts China's export and how then we already just win this debate by proving that to you, by having a clear and secure case, but something which none other team in this debate have. So firstly, I'll just talk you through our case and do some repair, then weighing it within the rest of the debate and adding some to it. Okay, so firstly, repair. So I've already told you what we told you. Okay, so what did CG respond to this? So they basically the only thing they say is, oh, but they will just devalue the yen. That is not what our case relies on, judges, right? We rely on the dollar devaluing and that just being bad for Chinese export, right? At the moment that the dollar devalues, it is less attractive for the US to then buy things from China. That is just and U.S. products will also just be will then be comparatively also less expensive to buy for by the rest of the country. Apart from that, adding on to this, if the dollar is weak, that also means that for countries loaning for the US, the interest on the loan is going to be cheaper. So this is then a typical point because its currency is then China's only advantage against the US. This is also a rebuttal flipping OG, so might sound a bit new. It's not really new, it's a rebuttal, sorry. So in the end, our case just stands. It was not rebuttal, I just added to it. Sam already did it amazingly. But just to weigh it, so Sam already told you that this is the only long-term shift we have in the debate, right? The entire debate has only told you how 4 years of Trump might look like. I don't really believe, sorry, that Trump is gonna be in term longer than the 4 years. That's not gonna happen. We have told you how in the long term, if these currencies shift, this will affect the entire economy and it will have to adapt the entire economy. In a second. We think that second point of weighting is that just the entire debate has also been relied on how Trump interacts with China directly, right? We tell you it doesn't really matter how they think about China, how the Democrats think about China. We tell you if they just devalue the dollar in the way that they are planning to do, they are never that is just inherently bad for China. It doesn't matter what the rest of the policies are. Yeah.
So the whole idea is Trump being bad in office is discrediting them as a global power, thus meaning that China has the opportunity to show the yen as a stable, valuably politically managed currency.
Okay, no, thank you. Never, ever, ever is the yen gonna be shown as a politically, and a stable currency. Obviously, China has devalued, the yen a lot, has made it more valuable, less valuable. That is never gonna be a very stable thing. And otherwise, it would then have to really tie itself, which would also, in some ways, be bad for China, because that is not, then they can't then devalue the yen if they want to export more in a couple of years' time, right? If they do want to seem like a stable currency, that is then going to be even better for our case, because then that shows that they're not going to be as good of an exporter. No, thank you. Okay, moving on to our opening. So what is really missing in this case? Two things, just comparative. They mentioned some things of Kamala, what they might do, what they're likely to do. But at the end, we do believe that Trump will do bad things for the economy, but we don't know what the Democrats will surely do. I have no idea at the end of that. Secondly, they're also just reliant on how trade with the US is the most important thing for the Chinese economy. We tell you it's likely, China also has other trading partners. We explain to you how the other trading partners are gonna, that is gonna also be worse on OG's side, because Trump is then gonna devalue the dollar, and that is then gonna make what do you call it? I'm sorry, ESL. Competition, yes, thank you. Okay, Sam explained this to you. We outweigh OO. We also win on their metric of the economy, so we win. No, thank you. Moving on to OG. So, Sam already, our case clashes already a lot with their case, but I'm just going to talk a bit about the Democrats and how they don't want to work with China ideologically. We think that is also just not how this is going to look like, right? If the Democrats really don't want to work with China ideologically to actually have an impact on the trade, they would have to devalue or make trade taxes worse. We think that they are very unlikely to do that because they just don't care enough, firstly, about China to do that. And secondly, they saw that it already really hurt them under Trump within the trade war, right? And thirdly, they aren't economically doing well enough to risk that trade war, but also to risk the trade between the two countries not going well because it's so interconnected. So they don't have a comparative in the end. Okay, sure, maybe Trump will do some good things for the economy of China. We think in the end, we explained to you how it's very surely going to be worse. Okay. Moving on to CG. Okay, CG has a bit of a weird case. They say, but the electric vehicle market is gonna be great for China, and okay, firstly, I just don't see how it matters, right? Within an economy of 1 billion people of China, how does a few more selling electric vehicles is gonna like make their economy like surge like from that? Like as we've heard in this debate, the economy isn't doing great, so this is not gonna be the tipping point to actually help their economy. Then they talk about soft power. We think it is unlikely that Trump is gonna get like away from the EU. We think that Trump is trying to make export happen if he would like get a term. Who has a lot of consumers to buy all your export products? The EU. Then who do you want to keep happy? The EU. We think it is unlikely that for that reason Trump will do it. But we think apart from that, Trump just also wants to have still like be stable within the global politics. Okay, in the end, we just have the only clear and comparative impact. Please vote CO.